It was a quiet morning in Aurora when the silence of a neighborhood was shattered by a desperate call. A mother, worried after failing to reach her daughter for 2 days, dialed 911. What seemed like a routine welfare check quickly turned into a macabre investigation no one could have predicted. But what could drive a devoted mother to vanish without a trace? And how can small details of everyday life become crucial pieces in solving a crime? The first answer is simple. Amber would never abandon her children voluntarily. It was against everything she stood for. The second points to something far darker. Subtle, almost invisible signs conceal the tragedy that had already taken root inside her own home. When officers arrived at the Zato residence, they were greeted only by the couple's children. The kids claimed their parents had left and didn't say when they would return. This odd response, combined with Amber's silence over the past days, raised immediate concern. Without legal authority to enter, the police contacted Betty once again, Amber's mother, who had already shown deep concern. At that moment, what began as a simple welfare call began to take on the shape of a mystery. Betty explained that during an earlier visit, she had noticed her daughter's car still in the driveway, her phone left on the table, and even her credit cards and bank documents untouched. Nothing suggested a planned departure. To make matters worse, she presented a suspicious note supposedly left behind by Amber. The text, filled with regret and disturbing references to her own death, clashed with the image of a woman known for her dedication to family and volunteering at her children's school. It was as if someone wanted to stage a final farewell. These inconsistencies, combined with Amber's sudden disappearance, led police to believe the case was far more than a simple runaway or emotional crisis. Without realizing it, everyone involved was already caught in a dark puzzle that would soon become one of the town's most unsettling stories. As soon as she was notified, Betty and her husband returned to their daughter's house to meet with the officers. Nervous, Betty handed them what troubled her the most, a letter left on the table. In it, Amber seemed to admit failures as a wife and asked that her own mother identify her body if something were to happen. The message felt cold, almost calculated, and stood in stark contrast to the caring personality everyone knew. The officers examined each line carefully. Although Amber had a history of emotional struggles, the note contained details that stood out, specific instructions that seemed too cruel to have been written spontaneously. For investigators, it was impossible to ignore the possibility that the message was fabricated to support a staged scenario. As they continued questioning Betty, other troubling details emerged. She insisted her daughter never disappeared without first taking refuge in her parents' home. Even in times of conflict with her husband, Amber always stayed in contact with family. The sudden silence, combined with the dramatic letter, did not align with any of her past behavior. With every statement, the officers built a fragile timeline filled with contradictions. Unable to enter the home legally, the only option was to seek permission from Keith, Amber's husband, who had not yet been located. Their hope was that with his consent, investigators could finally search the property and begin clarifying their growing doubts. What no one imagined was that this search would uncover details far beyond a simple marital dispute. Inside those walls, evidence of violence was waiting, ready to turn the case into a brutal crime scene. To move the investigation forward, the police used the children as intermediaries and managed to reach Keith by phone. On the other end of the line, he sounded calm and agreed to let them enter the home. This decision would prove critical, as it gave officers their first real opportunity to examine the residence since Amber's disappearance. During the conversation, Keith gave his version of events. He said the couple had argued intensely the previous night, fueled by alcohol and accusations. He claimed Amber smashed her phone, grabbed her purse, and stormed out. leaving only a letter on the coffee table. He also admitted that fights over money and suspected infidelity were constant, making their marriage increasingly unstable. Although his story sounded coherent at first, contradictions soon appeared. Keith admitted he had been extremely drunk that night and couldn't remember if the fight had turned physical. That detail alarmed investigators. It opened the possibility that something far worse had taken place inside the house. His behavior also raised suspicions. While he claimed Amber often left during arguments, he admitted that most of the time she went to her parents' house. This time, however, nothing suggested she had followed that pattern. Her personal documents, credit cards, and even her car remained untouched. As Keith clung to his confusing narrative, officers realized they needed concrete evidence from the home itself. It was clear that answers wouldn't come from words alone. From that moment forward, every corner of the Zato residence became a potential stage for grim revelations. As soon as they entered the residence, the officers paid close attention to every detail. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The furniture was in order, belongings untouched, and there were no obvious signs of forced entry. But within minutes, an unsettling feeling spread through the team. A strong, unmistakable odor was beginning to fill the air. The smell, instantly recognizable to experienced investigators, pointed to something horrific: decomposition. Hiding their concern to avoid alarming the children and family, the officers moved toward the garage, where the stench grew stronger. Among bags and accumulated debris stood a heavy trash can, its lid covered with pieces of carpet. When they opened it, the sight confirmed their worst fears. Inside was Amber's body, partially concealed beneath the rugs, with a gunshot wound to her head. Next to her lay the weapon used in the crime, discarded as if it were just another piece of garbage. The discovery instantly turned the case into a homicide investigation, eliminating the possibility of a voluntary disappearance or a runaway. The shock was immediate. Amber's mother, who had claimed to have checked the same container hours earlier without finding anything, suddenly became a focus of suspicion. Her composure in the face of tragedy, combined with the strange note discovered earlier, only deepened doubts. For the officers, however, there was no time for speculation. The priority was to secure the scene and begin collecting forensic evidence. At that moment, one certainty emerged. Amber's disappearance was no ordinary mystery. It was a brutal murder committed inside her own home. The question now was, who could have hidden such violence behind the facade of a seemingly ordinary family? The discovery of Amber's body raised even more questions for investigators. The detail that most unsettled them was Betty's earlier statement. She insisted she had checked the very same trash can that morning and found nothing. How? Then, just a few hours later, could the corpse and the murder weapon appear there? This inconsistency set detectives on high alert. Betty's demeanor didn't help either. Confronted with the confirmation of her daughter's death, she remained unusually calm, at times even cold. For the officers, it became impossible to rule out the possibility that the mother herself was withholding information or perhaps had even played a role in the tragedy. Meanwhile, Keith remained missing. His absence opened new lines of suspicion, as he had admitted to heated arguments and heavy drinking the night Amber disappeared. Combined with his blurry recollection of events and the couple's history of constant fights, he quickly shifted from key witness to prime suspect. Yet the investigation did not center on him alone. The children's behavior also raised eyebrows. Though they claimed not to have noticed anything unusual, Annabelle's calmness and her knowledge of the tensions in her parents' marriage unsettled investigators. Was it possible they were protecting someone or concealing critical details? With conflicting stories and fragmented leads, the police realized they would have to press harder during interrogations. Each new detail darkened the picture, revealing that behind the image of a normal family lurked secrets no one dared admit. With the scene secured, the forensic team began a meticulous sweep of the house. Soon, the first signs emerged showing Amber's death was not an isolated act, but part of a violent confrontation. Blood spatter was found in key areas: light switches, walls, and even the kitchen sink. The carpet pieces used to cover the trash can also showed clear signs of an attempted cover-up. Someone had tried to improvise a barrier to hide the body. Even the way the weapon was positioned on top of the victim suggested staging, a detail that to investigators reinforced the idea that the crime scene had been manipulated. As they cataloged each trace, the officers reflected on the possible scenarios of that fatal night. A fight spiraling out of control, an accidental shot fueled by intoxication, or a calculated act to eliminate Amber once and for all. Every hypothesis remained open, but each new clue pointed away from a moment of desperation and towards something darker. In this context, Keith's absence grew more troubling. If he was innocent, why hadn't he come forward? And if guilty, how long would it take before he confessed the truth? Answers were closing in, but critical pieces of the puzzle were still missing. Faced with so many contradictions, the police decided to bring Amber's closest relatives in for questioning. Betty insisted once again that she had checked the trash can earlier that day and found nothing, but her version only deepened suspicions. Ronald, Amber's father, was visibly shaken, unable to accept the idea that Keith could be responsible for the crime. The children, however, gave statements that blended innocence with a disturbing sense of maturity. Annabelle spoke openly about her parents' marital conflicts, even mentioning affairs, debts, and constant fights. Her calm demeanor when answering such delicate questions impressed the investigators, making them wonder if she was, in some way, protecting someone. Each testimony added new layers of complexity to the case. What could have been dismissed as domestic violence or an impulsive act was now unfolding into a web of family secrets and calculated silences. While the police were still searching for Keith, the turning point came through Susan Russ, the suspect's sister. She approached the officers and revealed that Keith had visited her just hours earlier. What she shared would completely change the direction of the investigation. Susan recounted that Keith had arrived distraught and in tears, confessing that the previous night had been filled with intense arguments with Amber. She said Amber had pulled out a gun during the fight, but Keith managed to wrestle it from her. According to him, the shot went off in a moment of rage and alcoholic blackout. This confession not only placed Keith at the center of the crime, but also dismantled his initial story that Amber had simply walked out of the house. For investigators, it was now clear her disappearance was, in fact, a homicide born from a marital confrontation that spiraled out of control. With Susan's testimony, the noose tightened. All that remained was to find Keith and ensure he was taken into custody before he could escape again, or worse, repeat the violence. The manhunt for Keith seemed endless until investigators received unexpected news. He had returned to his sister Susan's house. The alarm was immediate. They knew they were dealing with a man who had already killed once, who was armed and emotionally unstable. The police wasted no time in calling in the SWAT team, fully prepared for any unpredictable outcome. The operation was carried out in silence, every step calculated to prevent the situation from spiraling. Officers took strategic positions while the commander called out to Keith through a loudspeaker. Inside, the suspect hesitated for a few moments, heightening the tension. Then, finally, the door opened. Keith appeared with his head bowed, eyes red, and an expression of defeat. Following orders, he raised his hands slowly and began walking toward the officers. With each step, the air alternated between suspense and fear. Any sudden move could have turned his surrender into a bloody confrontation. But to the relief of the entire team, it ended without resistance. Keith was handcuffed in front of his sister, who stood silently, torn between sorrow and relief. His capture closed a chapter of uncertainty in the investigation and opened the door to the most crucial part, hearing from his own mouth the truth about Amber's murder. Taken to the police station, Keith looked exhausted, as if the full weight of the tragedy had finally collapsed onto his shoulders. Sitting before the detectives, he admitted that the night of the crime had been marked by endless arguments over money and infidelity. Alcohol, once again, had fueled anger and loss of control. According to his account, Amber had grabbed the gun during the fight. He claimed he managed to wrestle it from her hands, and then the shot went off. For Keith, it all happened too fast, like the blink of an eye that ended in deadly silence. Still, he could not explain how the body ended up in the garage trash can, or how rugs were used to cover it. The contradiction between admitting the shot and denying the concealment of the body made it clear to investigators that Keith was hiding part of the truth. Even so, his confession that he was the one who fired the gun was enough to establish him as the perpetrator. As questioning continued, Keith alternated between remorse and excuses. He claimed he couldn't remember details, blamed the alcohol, and even implied that Amber had also contributed to the escalation of the conflict. But to the detectives, there was no doubt. The responsibility for her death lay squarely with him. The next step would be to take the case to court, where all versions would be confronted before the law. From that point on, Keith's fate was in the hands of justice. Months after his arrest, Keith finally faced trial. The case had already gained notoriety in Aurora, and the courtroom was filled with onlookers, neighbors, and family members searching for definitive answers. The atmosphere was heavy with indignation, sorrow, and anticipation. During the trial, the prosecution presented the evidence collected: the gun found on top of the body, the blood spatter throughout the house, the suspicious letter, and the testimonies pointing to a history of violence and instability. Their argument was clear. Keith had not only killed Amber, but also tried to cover up the crime by staging a disappearance. The defense, on the other hand, insisted it was an accident. They claimed the shot had gone off during a heated argument fueled by alcohol and that Keith had never planned to take his wife's life. They emphasized that his memory lapses were a direct consequence of intoxication. Despite efforts to soften his guilt, the chain of evidence was overwhelming. The jury, attentive to every detail, had to decide between the version of an impulsive act and that of a deliberate murder. In the end, the decision was unanimous. Keith Zato was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict not only brought legal closure to the case, but also shattered the facade of a family that for years had appeared ordinary in the eyes of the community. In May 2021, Keith Zato received his final sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict officially ended the judicial process, but did not erase the scars left on everyone involved. The community, shaken by the brutality of the crime, still struggled to understand how a seemingly normal family had become the stage for such a tragedy. For Betty and Ronald, the pain was doubled. Not only had they lost their daughter in a cruel way, but they also had to face the fact that their son-in-law, the father of their grandchildren, was the one responsible for her murder. The children, in turn, would forever carry the memory of a childhood marked by violence, secrets, and the absence of their parents. The case also left deep lessons for investigators. From the suspicious note to the contradictions in every testimony, it became clear that small details can radically change the course of an investigation. The stench in the garage, the blood spatter in the house, and even the unsettling calm of certain statements were pieces that, once assembled, revealed the truth. In the end, Amber Zato's story became a grim reminder of how everyday conflicts, when mixed with alcohol, resentment, and lack of control, can spiral into irreversible consequences. Aurora was never the same after this crime, and Amber's memory endures as a symbol of the hidden violence that can exist behind the most ordinary doors. Enjoyed this case? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true crime stories like this. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. Hit the like button to support our work and share this video with fellow true crime fans.